We gather to remember those who could not grow old and those forced to grow old long before their time. We gather to mourn and grieve with one another all of our losses, the people, the stories, the loved ones, and the futures that could have been. We gather to do the hard work of facing the difficult realities of our present and our past, where there is conflict, violence, war and hatred. We gather to hold space for silence as we try to make meaning of our history to help us work for peace and justice today. We gather to rekindle our source of hope for our future by recognising in one another our shared humanity as we join in a concerted commitment for a better tomorrow. And we gather because we need community to do this holy work. These opening words by Nicole Mackay welcome all who have gathered this morning for our Remembrance Sunday service. Welcome to those of you gathered here in person at Essex Church, and welcome to those who are joining us via Zoom from far and wide. For anyone who doesn't know me, my name's James Blackall and I'm Minister with Kensington Unitarians. This morning's service will honour all those who have lost their lives in war, in all wars. We'll take time this hour to name our solemn witness of all the devastation that war leaves in its wake. The human cost, the death, the injury, the trauma which echoes down the generations, and all those other, perhaps more subtle losses that are sustained in the midst of conflict. So often on Remembrance Sunday we roll out those phrases, lest we forget, never again. And yet, in our culture, it seems that militarism is often glorified and the grim machinery of war rolls on regardless. So today we'll reflect on war and peace through poems, prayers, stories and hymns. And later in the service, Patricia Brewerton will offer her own personal reflections on remembrance. And the service will have a slightly different shape than usual in order to observe 2 minutes silence at 11 o'clock. But before we go any further, let us take a moment to check in with ourselves. Are you really here? Has your soul caught up with your body this morning? Do whatever you need to do to ground and steady yourself in this moment. Maybe you want to readjust your position, take a few conscious breaths. Do what you need to do to be here now. Let's light our chalice as we do each time we gather. It's a simple ritual that connects us in solidarity with Unitarians and Unitarian Universalists the world over. And it reminds us of the proudly progressive religious tradition of which this gathering is part. We light our chalice to illuminate the world we seek. In the search for truth, may we be just. In the search for justice, may we be loving. And in loving, may we find peace. Time to sing. Our first hymn is on your hymn sheet. It's a new one to me, but to a familiar tune, Once Crimson Poppies Bloomed. For those joining online, the words will be up on your screen. Feel free to stand or sit as you prefer. We are few in number in the church this morning, and poor Benji, who was meant to help us out, was laid up with COVID sadly this week. So let's make up for him as best we can. Once Crimson Poppies Bloomed. take all those joys and concerns, both spoken and unspoken, into an extended time of prayer and reflection now. This prayer is based on some words for Remembrance Sunday by Chris Gocher. You might want to adjust your position to get more comfortable. You might want to close your eyes or soften your gaze, perhaps have a look at the candles. Perhaps there's a posture that helps you to feel more centered and prayerful. Whatever works for you, whatever helps you to get into the right state of body and mind for us to pray together now. To be fully present in this sacred time and space with ourselves, with each other, and with that which lies both within us and beyond us. Spirit of life, God of all love, in whom we live and move and have our being, we turn our full attention to you, the light within and without, as we tune into the depths of this life and the greater wisdom to which and through which we are all intimately connected. Be with us now as we drop into the stillness and the silence at the very center of our being. We gather this day in thankful remembrance of all those who have sacrificed their lives for the freedom and safety of others, but also in shame at the wars that we have failed to stop and the actions sometimes taken in our name. Bless those who mourn and those whose lives are blighted by such terrible memories, be they military or civilian. Bless those who carry the scars of war with them for the rest of their lives, and for those who care for them. Bless those who know no place of safety right now, as war and violence rages on in so many places around our world. May forgiveness be found, personally and nationally, that all can learn to live in peace. May justice be sought, that the cycle of violence and oppression may be broken. We acknowledge that death recognizes not the colour of the uniform, nor the age, race, religion, or gender of each victim. We acknowledge that death and destruction comes because of our collective human failures, our greed, our neglect, our indifference. May we always remember the inherent worth and dignity of every human being. And let us dedicate ourselves to the greatest remembrance of all, that war should be no more. For such a future to be possible, may our prayers be heard. And in a few moments of shared quietness now, let us take a wider view. Let us look back over the week just gone and take stock of it all. And let us speak inwardly the deepest prayers of our hearts this day. Maybe something in our own life or the life of the wider world is weighing heavy on us. Or maybe we're feeling uplifted and full of gratitude. Maybe we feel moved to give thanks for our blessings. Let us each lift up whatever's on our heart this day and ask for what we most need. Spirit of life, God of all love. As this time of prayer draws to a close, we offer up our joys and our concerns, our hopes and our fears, our beauty and our brokenness. We call on you for insight, healing and renewal. As we look forward now to the coming week, help us to live well each day and be our best selves, using our unique gifts in the service of love, justice and peace. Amen. Time to sing once again. Our next hymn is number 191 in your green books. It's an old favourite. I think we've sung it quite recently, but the sentiment is so appropriate: to worship rightly. The words will once again be up on screen. Feel free to stand or sit as you prefer.
The Gift of Remembrance by George A. Tiger. This short reflection by George A. Tiger, a Unitarian Universalist minister who serves as a military chaplain, begins with some famous words of remembrance written in 1940 by Archibald MacLeish. The young dead soldiers do not speak. They have a silence that speaks for them at night and when the clock counts. They say, "We were young. We have died. Remember us." George Tiger continues with his own story of remembrance. He writes, "I met Scott's father a year after he was killed. It was a pilgrimage for me. I drove 1,000 miles, every moment wondering if he'd seen me as a symbol of a system that had taken his son. When he and his wife met me in the front yard, Mike and I hugged tightly for too short an eternity. As an army chaplain and therapist, I understood the spiritual, psychological, and physiological foundations of trauma. I can talk for hours about how the body keeps the score, about vagus nerve response, about the fight, flight, or freeze mechanism. I can reflect with you about the spiritual meaning of loss, grief, and suffering, how they fit into your life, and how they can burden the soul if held too tightly. I understand all this, yet not a day goes by when something doesn't bring to mind a young life now gone. Ghosts of what might have been are my everyday companions. I will not let them go, for I fear, if I do, that I will forget. I'm greeted when least expected with waves of unbidden grief, a tightness in the throat, vision blurred a bit by welling tears, a little tremor in my hand, all things that remind me that I cannot, I will not forget. How many children lost, how many parents grieve. These memories, these ghosts, are necessary reminders of the futility of war and the desperate need for peace in our world. The memories which come upon me, not as thoughts, but as bodily sensations, have deepened my compassion and steeled my commitment to bringing peace to this suffering world. I serve in the army. I support the readiness of those who have fought the wars our civilian leaders call us to fight. I love the people I'm called to serve, knowing full well the dreadful reality we will one day face again. How then can I speak of peace? This is the difficulty of such a day of remembrance. Remembrance Sunday is not a day to be celebrated. It is to be observed, scrutinized, and witnessed on behalf of the true witnesses of our human failure to love our neighbor as ourselves. They are ghosts now, haunting lives with the gift of remembrance so that we will not forget their living, but even more, that the grief of remembering will create in us a yearning for peace that will stir us to action. George Tiger closes his reflection with a few brief words of prayer. Gracious God, living spirit of love, give to me compassion steeled with commitment, that I might become your peace given in loving sacrifice to our troubled and hurting world. Amen.
Thanks, Antony. As you may have noticed, I've already diverged a bit from the order of service to make sure we arrive at the silence at the right time. So I'm also going to share a poem now. This is by the Polish poet Wisława Szymborska, and it's entitled The End and the Beginning. It's about the impact of war and the aftermath. After every war, someone has to clear up. Things won't straighten themselves up after all. Someone has to push the rubble to the side of the road so the corpse-filled wagons can pass. Someone has to get mired in scum and ashes, sofa springs, splintered glass, and bloody rags. Someone has to drag in a girder to prop up a wall. Someone has to glaze a window, rehang a door. Photogenic it's not, and it takes years. All the cameras have left for another war. We'll need the bridges back and new railway stations. Sleeves will go ragged from rolling them up. Someone, broom in hand, still recalls the way it was. Someone else listens and nods with an unsevered head. But already there are those nearby starting to mill about who will find it dull. From out of the bushes, sometimes someone still unearths rusted out arguments and carries them to the garbage pile. Those who knew what was going on there must make way for those who know little and less than little, and finally as little as nothing. In the grass that has overgrown causes and effects, someone must be stretched out, blade of grass in his mouth, gazing at the clouds. So as the clock moves towards 11 a.m., the traditional time to stand in silent tribute to all those who have died or suffered in warfare, I invite you to stand now if you so wish. Our time of silence will be ended by the sound of a bell and an invitation to join in with a responsive prayer of peace for our world. And I invite you to join in, if you wish, with this prayer for world peace. The words are printed in your order of service, but it's a very simple, repeated refrain. We lift up our hearts. I invite you to join in. For all who die in war, we lift up our hearts. For all who live in suffering in the aftermath of violence, we lift up our hearts. For all who give their lives in smoke and flame, we lift up our hearts. For all who go on in honour of the dead, we lift up our hearts. For all who have served, we lift up our hearts. For our country and our world, we lift up our hearts. For a planet that will find peace, we lift up our hearts. For the young and the innocent, we lift up our hearts. For the weary and war-torn, we lift up our hearts. For those who would pray, we lift up our hearts. For those too angry to cry, we lift up our hearts. For all of us and for the many names of God, we lift up our hearts. We lift up our hearts. Shanti, Shalom, peace, Salam. Amen.
Amongst the early printed books in the British Library, books printed in the early part of the 16th century, are some how-to books, books devoted to teaching skills such as swimming or riding a horse, for instance. There is also one on the art of memory, which includes the very helpful advice not to go to bed with your shoes and socks on. It's advice I always follow. These books were aimed at people, men I suppose, wishing to rise in society. And in a time before easy access to writing materials, memory was extremely important. There are many aspects to this word memory, from just remembering to turn your phone to silent before the service, to remember events and people from our past. Remembrance has the added meaning of remembering with honor. On this Remembrance Sunday, I want to look at what we remember, and more importantly, how we remember. Let's first recall how the annual event of remembering began and what it remembered. At 12 minutes past 5 in the morning of the 11th of November, 1918, an armistice or ceasefire was signed, which would bring to an end the horrendous war, which it's estimated claimed over 15 million lives. Although the agreement was signed just after 5 a.m., it was agreed that fighting would only cease some 6 hours later at 11 o'clock, allowing sufficient time for 2,000 more senseless deaths. It is therefore at the 11th hour of the 11th day in the 11th month every year that we are asked to fall silent for 2 minutes to honor those members of the armed forces who have been killed in wars. And it's on the Sunday following the 11th that pomp and ceremony around the cenotaph and smaller gatherings around many war memorials in villages and towns in this country take place, and when we have paused for 2 minutes here in Essex Church. The First World War, which inspired so many poems, films, and novels, was so horrific that the writer H.G. Wells called it the war to end all wars. That foolery would end. It is the last war. Tragically, he was wrong. And yesterday, on the 11th day of the 11th month, at the 11th hour, people were still dying in so many wars, in so many places. Some time ago, I read a very moving essay by a Jewish rabbi about remembering and memorials. He wrote that was little use in remembering and honoring the dead unless we are prepared to learn the lessons from these remembrances. Sadly, history shows us that we do not learn those lessons. So is there something wrong with the way we remember? Perhaps something wrong with some of our memorials? There is one memorial which I have come to know very well. I first encountered it during a conversation with someone, knowing I was going to stay in the village of La Quade in France, asked if I'd seen the war memorial there. At this point, I hadn't, but it was clearly of interest to visitors to the island, a kind of tourist attraction. Since then, I have stood in front of it many times and taken friends to see it. I hope you can see it on the screen. I first thought that the bird lying sprawled dead in front of the memorial represented France and the horrors suffered by France in that war to end all wars. But I've since learned the story of the memorial, which I'd like to share with you. It is set in a kind of park in the smartest part of the village. The grass here is always fresh and green, as the park is tended almost daily. The land was given to the community by the master of the primary school, which faces the green, and who lived in the schoolhouse attached. And the memorial itself was the initiative of this man, who had lost his only son in the war, one of 36 men from the village to die. It is situated at the end of an avenue of cypress trees leading from opposite the school gates. The largest part of the memorial is the wall, made from a single block of stone, before which the bird has fallen. A poem on the back of this wall tells us that it symbolizes a body of soldiers who, by their courage and strength, stopped the advance of the enemy. The falling bird is the German eagle with its neck broken. So what I thought represented sorrow represents something tougher to deal with: anger, revenge, an attempt to humiliate a former enemy. It's easy to understand that anger, that desire for revenge after the loss of so many lives from a small community. But I sometimes wonder what that schoolmaster felt when every day he looked out onto that fallen eagle. He would have seen it every time he opened the door to let the children in and out of school, every morning when he looked out of his bedroom window. He would have watched as it was dismantled when the village was occupied during the Second World War. And he would have been there when it was retrieved from under a pile of wood in the church and put back in the place where he could see it every day. Did the memorial ease his grief? Did it soothe his anger, or just remind him of his pain each time he looked at it? When we remember the past, we bring the past back into the present and relive the joys or sorrows of that time. I don't expect any of us have monuments to our past, but I'm sure we all have mementos of people, places, or times which bring our past back to us. I recently read about a journalist in Gaza who was forced to leave the home her father had built to move to the south. She took with her, amongst her passport, papers, food, and a few clothes, several green leaves from the tree in the courtyard, a bittersweet reminder of home until she could return. I'm sure we all have mementos like these. On the windowsill in my study, there is the decaying remains of a large black beetle. It's now more brown than black, and one of its legs has fallen off. It's certainly not a thing of beauty. I found it one day when standing at a level crossing, holding my little grandson's hand, watching for trains. We picked it up and took it home, and now it takes me back some 8 years to the time when it was okay for Arthur to hold Grandma's hand. When we gaze on these mementos, there is sometimes sadness, but it is mixed with love and joy. But we all have memories which make us really miserable, memories that make us angry as well as sad. Maybe these are memories of times when we have been made to feel small, maybe times when our feelings have been badly hurt in some way. It's tempting to hold on to these memories, to construct our own fallen eagles, which we gaze on, working out how we can get back at whomever has hurt us. And I know I'm sometimes guilty of this. We have no say in how our leaders choose to remember past conflicts, and I'm sure names will keep being added to our memorials as they fail to learn the lessons those memorials could teach. But perhaps if we could find ways to melt the bronze fallen eagles we carry in our own hearts, we would make peace in our own lives. Our world will never be at peace and unafraid until we all learn to let go of our own anger and hurt. It would be lovely to think that we, the ordinary people, could show our world leaders how to turn swords into plowshares so that nations would make war no more. Okay, it's time for our last hymn. It's on your hymn sheets, Vine and Fig Tree. It's a simple chant which we can repeat time and again until we've had enough. Once we've sung it a few times in full and people have grasped the tune, it is possible, maybe not because there's not many of us, to break out into a round if you're feeling confident. Just keep going until Jane comes to the lectern. Then we will gently bring it to a close by repeating the last line. Perhaps Andrew can play the tune through once for those who don't know it before we start to sing.
Just a few announcements then. Thanks very much to Patricia for her reflections today. Thanks to Antony for reading. Thanks to Ramona for hosting and Charlotte for welcoming everyone at home. Thanks to Abby and Andrew for the lovely music as ever. Thanks to David for doing the coffee and Juliet for greeting. For those of you who are here in person, it's Mr. Kipling style lemon cake for the coffee time today, served in the hall next door. Do hang on after the service for a chat with Charlotte if you'd like to. We've got various small group activities going on during the week. Heart and Soul, our contemplative spiritual gathering, will be on tonight or Friday at 7 o'clock. This week's theme is expertise. Next Sunday, Sarah will be here leading our service on St. Cecilia and music's many gifts. We've got various save the dates to mention, especially in relation to Christmas events. There's a flyer in the foyer, or the details are in the Friday email. The main carol service will be on Sunday the 17th of December, and that will be followed by a potluck lunch. If any of your friends and family might like to join us, the more the merrier. If you're going to come along to the lunch, please let Patricia know what you're planning to bring so that we make sure we don't end up with a surfeit of hummus. We've also got a candlelit Christmas service on the 24th at 5 o'clock. There's no Sunday morning service that day, just the evening service, and that's always quite a magical evening. As you may have noticed, we're slowly updating and reinstating all our leaflets and posters around the building. I'd encourage you to take them away, give them to anyone who might be interested, especially the Christmas events, because that's often a thing that people like to join in with. You'll see more things appearing in the coming weeks and months. If you remember, you'll have received an email in the last week or so about the congregational programme. We're trying to work out where to put our efforts in terms of in-person and online events. Please do respond to that in the next week or so if you can, because that will inform our decisions for 2024. I think that's everything. Details are in the email on the back of the order of service. Do get in touch about anything you want to be involved in. This congregation very much has a life beyond Sunday morning, so we encourage you to keep in touch and look out for each other. Do what you can to nurture supportive connections. So just time for our closing words and closing music. We've shared this hour of worship as we share this membership of our living earth and our human family. So as we part, let us remember the ties which hold us close, the divine unity in which we exist, and the path of loving faith that leads us from death to life. And in that spirit, let us conclude with the universal prayer for peace. Lead us from death to life, from falsehood to truth. Lead us from despair to hope, from fear to trust. Lead us from hate to love, from war to peace. Let peace fill our heart, our world, our universe. Amen.